There's a version of highway driving that most people never see. It happens after midnight, when traffic thins out and the road becomes something else entirely. The drivers who work these hours, long-haul truckers, delivery operators, logistics runners, don't talk much about how they make decisions. Not because it's secret, but because the logic doesn't translate well to daytime driving. Night driving on highways isn't just daytime driving in the dark. The variables change. Visibility drops. Fatigue accumulates differently. Other drivers behave unpredictably. And the infrastructure itself, lighting, signage, lane markers, functions at reduced capacity. Professional night drivers develop a specific set of priorities that don't match what's taught in driving schools. These aren't shortcuts or risky behaviors. They're adaptations to an environment where the usual rules don't cover what actually happens. This isn't about breaking protocol. It's about recognizing that protocol was written for conditions that don't exist at 3 a.m. on a rural interstate. The rule we're examining isn't written anywhere. It's not part of training manuals. And when outsiders hear it, they often misunderstand what it means. Night highways operate under different physical conditions than daytime roads. Visibility range contracts. Even with headlights, drivers see maybe 300 feet clearly on low beams, perhaps 500 on high beams if the road is empty. Compare that to daytime visibility of several miles. This compression changes how decisions get made. Lighting is inconsistent. Urban highways have regular streetlights. Rural interstates have stretches of complete darkness interrupted by occasional lit sections near exits or towns. This creates zones where drivers transition repeatedly between illuminated and dark conditions. Eyes adjust slowly, which means there's always a period of reduced vision after leaving a lit area. Traffic patterns shift dramatically. During daytime, highways have continuous flow. At night, especially after midnight, traffic becomes clustered. Long empty stretches, then suddenly a group of vehicles. This clustering happens because drivers unconsciously pace themselves near other vehicles for reference points and alertness. Fatigue operates on a different timeline at night. It's not linear. Drivers don't get steadily more tired. Instead, fatigue comes in waves, typically hitting hardest between 2 and 4 a.m. Professional night drivers recognize these waves and have routines to manage them. Not eliminate them, manage them. The routine for long-haul night drivers follows a rhythm that outsiders don't see. Pre-trip inspections happen in darkness, using flashlights and muscle memory. Navigation relies more on mile markers and exit numbers than visual landmarks. Rest stops are chosen based on lighting and vehicle presence, not amenities. Communication drops off at night. Dispatch centers run skeleton crews. Other drivers are focused on their own routes. Radio chatter decreases. This creates an environment where drivers operate with extended periods of no external input. They're making continuous small decisions without immediate feedback or correction. Road conditions become harder to assess. A patch of standing water isn't visible until headlights hit it. Ice forms in shadows and under overpasses while the rest of the road stays clear. Animals appear without warning because they don't reflect light the same way vehicles do. Debris is harder to identify until it's very close. The sensory environment is reduced. Fewer visual inputs, less sound variation, more vibration from the road transmitted through the vehicle. This sensory reduction means drivers rely more on pattern recognition than active observation. They're watching for deviations from expected patterns rather than processing every detail. Weather impacts night driving differently. Rain reduces visibility more severely at night because headlights create glare. Fog becomes disorienting without daytime depth perception. Snow obscures lane markers that were already hard to see. Professional drivers adjust their entire approach when weather enters the equation, not just their speed. The central rule that night drivers follow but rarely explain is this: trust your first instinct about other vehicles, then increase distance. This sounds simple. It's not about paranoia or assuming the worst. It's about recognizing that night driving involves operating with incomplete information, and the cost of hesitation is higher than the cost of caution. Here's why this rule exists. At night, drivers have less time to assess other vehicles. They see headlights or taillights, but they can't clearly see the vehicle type, its condition, or how it's being operated until they're much closer. By the time they have full information, they're already committed to whatever position they've taken on the road. Professional night drivers make initial assessments based on minimal cues. How steady are those headlights? Are they weaving slightly? Is the vehicle maintaining consistent speed? Is it positioned oddly in its lane? These micro-observations happen in seconds, often at distances where the other vehicle is just lights. The rule says, if anything seems off, trust that impression immediately. Don't wait for confirmation. Don't rationalize it away. Don't assume you're being overly cautious. Just increase distance. This isn't about aggressive maneuvering. It's about creating buffer space. If a vehicle ahead seems unstable, drop back. If a vehicle behind is following too close, change lanes or adjust speed to let them pass. If a vehicle in the adjacent lane is drifting, increase lateral distance. The decision pressure comes from limited processing time. During daytime, drivers have several seconds to evaluate a situation, consider options, and respond. At night, that window shrinks. Reaction time stays the same, but the time available for decision-making decreases because threats appear closer. Night drivers prioritize spacing over position. Position being in the right lane, maintaining speed, staying on schedule, matters less than having space around their vehicle. They'll sacrifice efficiency to maintain distance from vehicles that trigger their instinct. They deliberately ignore certain pressures. Schedule pressure, the expectation to maintain certain speeds, the temptation to stay in the optimal lane. If their instinct says something's wrong with another vehicle, they create distance regardless of other considerations. This rule conflicts with defensive driving as it's commonly taught. Standard defensive driving says to assess, predict, decide, and execute. Night drivers collapse that process. Assess and decide become the same step. If the assessment triggers concern, the decision is already made. Increase distance. Hesitation is costly at night because the environment provides fewer opportunities to correct mistakes. During the day, if a driver misjudges a situation, they usually have time and space to adjust. At night, the margins are smaller. By the time a bad situation becomes obvious, options have already narrowed. Professional drivers watch for specific indicators: vehicles that change speed irregularly, vehicles that drift within their lane without correcting, vehicles with unusual lighting, one headlight out, taillights dimmer than normal, vehicles that brake erratically. Any of these triggers the rule: trust your instinct, increase distance. They also watch for vehicles that appear suddenly. This happens more often at night because drivers have limited visibility into adjacent lanes and behind them. A vehicle that appears unexpectedly in a mirror is treated with extra caution, not because it did anything wrong, but because its sudden presence means the driver missed something in their scanning routine. The rule extends to predicting behavior. If a vehicle seems unstable, professional drivers assume it will do the least predictable thing. If it's weaving, they assume it might swerve fully into their lane. If it's following too close, they assume it won't brake in time. If it's driving too slowly, they assume it might stop suddenly. This isn't pessimism. It's operating with the understanding that night driving involves more impaired drivers, more fatigued drivers, and more drivers unfamiliar with the roads they're on. The probability of unpredictable behavior is higher, so the response adjusts accordingly. The core rule about trusting instinct sits within a broader set of unwritten protocols that govern night driving. These rules don't appear in handbooks because they require experiential knowledge to apply correctly. Never assume a vehicle sees you. At night, blind spots are larger and less predictable. Drivers miss mirror checks more often. Professional night drivers operate as if they're invisible to other vehicles until proven otherwise. They position themselves where they can be seen, not where they should theoretically be visible, but where they're most likely to register in another driver's awareness. Give extra space to vehicles with out-of-state plates. This isn't about geography, it's about familiarity. A driver from out of state is navigating unfamiliar roads at night. They're more likely to brake suddenly for exits, drift while reading signs, or make uncertain lane changes. Professional drivers spot out-of-state plates early and create buffer space. Watch tire spray patterns in rain. The way water sprays from tires indicates speed and stability. Irregular patterns suggest irregular driving. Professional drivers read these patterns from a distance and use them to assess vehicles before getting close enough to see other details. Avoid being the only other vehicle near another vehicle. This seems counterintuitive, but professional drivers know that when there are only two vehicles in a stretch of highway, drivers unconsciously pace each other. They match speeds without realizing it. This creates a situation where both vehicles stay in close proximity for extended periods. Professional drivers deliberately break this pattern by either pulling ahead or dropping back significantly. Never trust that a driver signaling will complete the indicated action. Turn signals at night don't guarantee behavior. They might indicate intention, but professional drivers wait for actual movement before reacting. They've seen too many signals left on accidentally or changed mid-maneuver. Use high beams strategically, not maximally. High beams provide better visibility, but they also create glare for oncoming traffic and vehicles ahead. Professional drivers flip between high and low beams constantly, using high beams only when they won't affect other drivers. This requires continuous attention to traffic patterns. Maintain awareness of exit locations even when not exiting. Night drivers track upcoming exits because they're the most likely locations for unpredictable behavior. Vehicles slow down, speed up, change lanes suddenly. Exits create decision pressure for other drivers, which means professional drivers increase their alertness near exits whether they're using them or not. These rules share a common foundation. They all involve creating buffer space and maintaining awareness without depending on other drivers to behave predictably. They're not about paranoia. They're about recognizing that night driving involves operating in an environment with reduced information and increased variability. Experience matters more than instruction because these rules require calibrated judgment. New drivers might increase distance, but do it inconsistently or excessively. Experienced drivers know exactly how much space is needed and when. They read situations faster and respond proportionally. The calibration comes from repetition. After thousands of hours of night driving, professionals develop pattern recognition that operates below conscious awareness. They spot problems earlier not because they're looking harder, but because their recognition systems are tuned to the specific patterns that indicate issues. Following these unwritten rules changes outcomes in measurable ways. Professional night drivers have fewer close calls, not because they're more skilled at maneuvering, but because they avoid situations that require skilled maneuvering. They're rarely surprised because they've already created space around potential surprises. When these rules are followed, the immediate effect is increased travel time. Maintaining distance, changing lanes to avoid uncertain vehicles, dropping back from clusters. All of this adds minutes to a route. Professional drivers accept this trade-off. The time cost is predictable and small. The alternative cost is unpredictable and large. Efficiency decreases slightly, but consistency increases significantly. A driver who maintains rigid efficiency might complete 9 trips with no issues and 1 trip with a major problem. A driver who follows night driving protocols completes all 10 trips with minor delays but no problems. Over time, the second approach is more reliable. Safety margins expand. When professional drivers maintain distance based on instinct, They create situations where problems can occur without requiring emergency responses. A vehicle swerves, but there's already extra space. A driver brakes suddenly, but following distance is already increased. The problem happens but doesn't escalate. When these rules are ignored, the pattern reverses. Drivers find themselves repeatedly using hard braking. They experience frequent close calls that they attribute to other drivers' mistakes. They maintain schedule better in the short term but accumulate stress and near misses that eventually convert into actual incidents. The consequences aren't immediate or obvious. A driver can ignore these protocols for months without incident, but they're operating with smaller margins, and eventually those margins fail. The professional approach isn't about avoiding every problem. It's about avoiding the problems that can't be recovered from. Following distance becomes the most visible difference. Professional night drivers maintain following distances that seem excessive to casual observers. 2 car lengths becomes 4 car lengths. 3 seconds becomes 5 seconds. This looks overly cautious until you watch how often it absorbs situations that would otherwise require hard braking. Lane positioning shifts. Professional drivers avoid the far left lane at night unless actively passing. They prefer the center lane on 3-lane highways because it provides options in both directions. They avoid the far right lane in areas with frequent exits. This positioning reduces the likelihood of being trapped by other vehicles' decisions. Speed becomes more variable. Professional night drivers don't maintain perfectly constant speed. They adjust based on traffic patterns, lighting conditions, and their own fatigue levels. They're more willing to drop below prevailing traffic speed if it means maintaining space. They're also willing to accelerate past clusters to reach empty sections of highway. The rule about trusting instinct and increasing distance makes complete sense to anyone who drives highways at night regularly. It feels obvious from inside the work. From outside, it might sound like overcaution or paranoia, but night highway driving operates under constraints that don't exist during daytime. Less information, less time, more variability, higher stakes. The rule is an adaptation to those constraints, not a personality trait or risk preference. These patterns exist because professional night drivers have learned what works through extended repetition. They're not following intuition in some mystical sense. They're following pattern recognition that's been refined over thousands of hours of operation in these specific conditions. The logic is consistent. When information is limited, trust your first assessment and create space. When margins are smaller, increase buffer zones. When variability is higher, reduce dependencies on other drivers' behavior. This approach doesn't eliminate problems. It shifts the distribution of outcomes. Fewer surprises, more minor delays. Fewer emergencies, more routine adjustments. Over time, this produces more consistent results with less stress and fewer serious incidents. The rule remains unspoken not because it's sensitive, but because it's hard to explain without sounding like you're criticizing other drivers or claiming special insight. Professional night drivers just do it. They maintain distance, they trust their instincts, they create space. It becomes automatic. From the outside, it looks like just another vehicle on the highway. From the inside, it's a continuous process of assessment, distance management, and pattern recognition. The difference is invisible until you understand what you're watching. That's how night driving works. Not through dramatic decisions, but through consistent application of adapted logic that makes sense only in these conditions.